Good evening. Welcome to the Douglas Hills Church of Christ. This is our regular Tuesday night study on the crucifixion as a historic event. Let's begin this evening with a word of prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, Father, we are thankful for the opportunity over the course of the last 13 weeks, Father, to be able to gather through this format, to come together as a congregation, Father, and to immerse ourselves into the record and the memory of your Son. Father, in particular, we are so thankful for the opportunity to study the pinnacle moment of human history, which is the crucifixion, the death that your Son was willing to die, not for the things that he had done wrong, but, Father, for us. Father, we're so thankful for the record that is left on our behalf. We're so thankful for the gospel writers and for others who have made record and made it possible for us to understand, made it possible for us to study, made it possible for us to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. But we are particularly thankful for him. We're thankful for the life that he lived. We're thankful for the example that he provides for us. And of course, we are thankful for the death that he died. It's in his glorious name that we pray. Amen. All right, so this evening is our last class in what has been 13 weeks since we started this class. We've covered a good deal of ground here. As you know, last week we concluded the sort of narrative leading up to the crucifixion by talking in serious detail, realistic detail, about the remarkable brutality that crucifixion is, remarkable brutality and the heinous things that Jesus had to experience, the suffering that began in the garden that led throughout the night while he was before the Sanhedrin and being held there, the brutality that he faced at the end of the trial before the prefect when he was scourged and whenever he was crowned with a crown of thorns, and then of course the terrible, heinous, inhumane death that is crucifixion. But for the last 13 weeks here, for the last 12 weeks here, we've set out for the purpose of really trying to immerse ourselves in this world and to understand this act, the crucifixion, as a historic event, to examine all of the factors that contributed to it, all of the cultural factors, the political factors, the religious factors that lead directly to the cross. I said at the outset of the class that objectively, one has to recognize, whether they're a believer or not, that the crucifixion is the seminal event in human history. No event ever in human history, not the French Revolution, not the First World War, not the fall of the Roman Empire, there is nothing that has done more to shape the world, to shape virtually every facet of the world, than the death of Jesus did. It is the pinnacle, apex event in human history. So we set out to study it and to understand it from that perspective and to understand all of the things that led to it. We talked a great deal about the role that Hellenization played. We talked about the role that Second Temple Judaism played. We talked about the role that the Romans played and all of the various cultural forces pulling and trying to work against Rome, trying to work in protection of Rome, trying to maintain the status of the kingdom. All of these things which in so many ways and so perfectly come together there on the week leading up to the Passover before Jesus is put to death. I'll note just a couple of things. I do want to make sure that at the beginning here, before we get into the meat of our conversation tonight, which is titled The End of the Beginning. Tonight we're going to discuss this question: why didn't the movement die? A few weeks ago, in week 6, we talked about some of these other individuals who had stepped up and tried to fulfill the hopes of the messianic ambitions that existed in the region, that existed in Judaism at the time. Some of the other individuals who stepped up and who they themselves claimed to be the Messiah, some of which were put to death for claiming to be the Messiah. We talked about the Zealots and some of the other movements that had sought to have such a world-altering experience that, for the most part, have been forgotten to history. And so tonight what I want to discuss is, why is it from a historic standpoint that this movement continued the way that it did? Why is it that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this event, this Messiah? Why are we still talking about this man, Jesus? Before we get into the meat of that, I do just want to thank the congregation. I want to thank so many of you who have been encouraging through the course of this class, so many of you who have reached out with encouraging words, so many of you have brought interesting points and topics to my attention. I can't thank you enough for those things. This is a class that I've been thinking about for about 6 years, really. I picked up a book whenever I was in grad school by a guy named Werner Jager, who was a classicist who studied Greek culture, and the book had nothing to do with the crucifixion. It had to do, he had given a series of lectures at Harvard at the end of his life where he wrote about the impact that Greek culture had on Christianity. And for whatever reason, that just kind of opened my mind to this thought about the impact that the world around Jesus had on the crucifixion. And so I'm so thankful that we had the opportunity to go through this class. I'm confident that there are numerous things in the class that as time goes by, I might change my position on, or there are so many things that we left with maybe, so many things that we just can't conclude for sure, but it's been a wonderful exploration, and I want to thank you for being part of it. So let's get into this question, though, this evening. Why didn't the movement die? I've titled it At the End of the Beginning, because, of course, that's a little bit of a quote stolen from Churchill, but the crucifixion really is not the end even a little bit. It is, at best, the end of the beginning. It is the point where this world-altering movement that ends up touching every corner of the earth really takes off. Let's get into that question. Why didn't the movement die? The first years after Jesus' ascension led to a steady growth among the followers who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, starting on the day of Pentecost, 7 weeks after the crucifixion, where 5,000 individuals were baptized, converted Jews, and the numbers gradually increased thereafter. But with increase, of course, comes complications. More money, more problems, as the great Christopher Wallace once said. The first issue that this new burgeoning group, of course, ran into is that newfound growth means newfound attention and the threat of strife with leaders. Pontius Pilate is still the prefect on the day of Pentecost. Herod Antipater is still the tetrarch over Galilee on the day of Pentecost. Caiaphas is still the high priest. Annas the high priest is still the wealthiest Jew in all of Judea. All of the figures who plotted, orchestrated, and carried out the crucifixion of Jesus are still in place 7 weeks afterwards, and still in place for several years after Jesus' death. That's the first issue that this growing group has to deal with. And of course, the first chapters of Acts are repeatedly going to focus on some of those interactions. With growth also comes the opportunity for division, though. Acts chapter 6 provides the details, probably a couple years removed from the resurrection of Jesus and the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, reading from the English Standard there. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews, because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, who we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." It is hard to point to the specific moment that completely jumpstarts the growth of the early church. Pentecost is obviously extremely important, but without the institutionalization that follows, there are so many different moments that really there are a handful that build together. But I would argue that there is a single microcosmic event, a single instance where all of the factors that would shape the first century of Christianity converge on one another. And it centers around a member of this group that the apostles appointed, referenced here in Acts chapter 6. A Hellenized Jew, almost certainly a convert, one who had probably not been a follower of Jesus before his death, named Stephen. The now centuries-old Jewish rift over Hellenization, which we have discussed repeatedly over the course of this class and our time together, the now centuries-old rift in Judaism over Hellenization, unsurprisingly overlapped into the early church. And the collection established to assist widows that's referenced here in Acts chapter 6, that was collected there and was to be distributed to widows, the Hellenists felt like their widows were being treated unfairly. There are, as Luke notes here in Acts chapter 6, two distinct camps, clearly, that begin to emerge here in the first years, lest one thinks that religious division is a uniquely modern problem. The early church didn't make it a few years without at least clearly two distinct groups sort of emerging. Now understand what makes this distinction between the Hellenists and the Hebrews significant. It's the same thing that always made this rift significant, this rift that we have discussed that is, again, centuries old and stretches back over the influence of Greek society in the region. Generally speaking, the Hebrews spoke Aramaic, the Hellenists spoke Greek. The Hebrews were more rural, the Hellenists were more urban. The Hellenists were typically the Hebrews were typically farmers and fishermen. The Hellenists were wealthier. Some of them were landowners. Think of Ananias and Sapphira, for example, who we can reasonably conclude were Hellenists. They have Greek names, and they sold a piece of property. They were almost certainly Hellenists. This is a risky division for a community barely in infancy, this rift overlapping between these two. So the apostles called together all the disciples in Jerusalem, as is noted here in Acts chapter 6, and they establish a group of 7 men. The 7 men will take responsibility for the issue that's been raised with the widows. This group will make sure that the distribution is done properly and fairly. The decision seems to work very well, and after a brief interruption, the community starts growing again, Acts chapter 6, 7. And the word of God continued to increase, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Things are going well. After this group is established, as is noted in Acts chapter 6, verse 7 there, the numbers begin to grow. Even many members of the priesthood become obedient to the faith. But one day, one of the 7 who had been appointed, a particularly zealous man, full of wisdom, gifted with the ability to do signs and wonders, was preaching when a member of a Hellenized group of Jews still faithful to the old law, members of the, quote, synagogue of the freedmen, got in a dispute with him. Later in Acts chapter 6, verse 12. And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council. And they set up false witnesses who said, "This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." The similarities are easy for us to immediately recognize. Stephen is seized. He's brought before the Sanhedrin. Familiar? False witnesses are brought forward. And the high priest asks him a question. Now, unlike Jesus, who's compelled to answer only by being put under oath by the priest, you might remember, Stephen is more willing and has much more to say to the great Sanhedrin than Jesus had said on the night of his trial. And boy, what a speech it was. From Abraham to Joseph to Moses, Jacob, Solomon, he recounts the beloved history of the Jewish people, a history that every member of the great Sanhedrin would have revered and would have understood. He builds this masterful speech to its apex in Acts chapter 7, verse 51. "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets do your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You have received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." He looked up to the sky and continued. And he said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." The Sanhedrin, the great council of 71, this same group who had been at the center of so much of the strife that dominated Jesus' life, who had in so many ways orchestrated the actions that took place in the final week of his life, who had just a few chapters earlier threatened Peter and John, encouraged them and tried to force them to stop this teaching, had had enough. There was no marching Stephen off to the prefect. There was no waiting for justice to be properly administered. This time, mob justice prevailed. Outside of the gates of Jerusalem, Stephen dies a martyr's death at the hands of those who he had preached this sermon against and who he had said to them that they were stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart. Stephen dies a martyr's death, all the while asking the Lord to forgive his murderers. That's Rembrandt's version of the events. Rembrandt's first painting, trivia quiz if you ever find yourself on Jeopardy, stoning of Stephen there. Wonderful piece. What happened next after the stoning of Stephen that took place outside of the gates of Jerusalem at the hands of the members of the Sanhedrin, what happened next is partially what makes this moment so incredibly significant. Acts chapter 8, verse 1. "Then there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles." Continuing in Acts chapter 8, verse 4. "Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word." This persecution that begins to take place after the Sanhedrin and the members of the Jewish aristocracy, and even deeper than that, the members of Jewish life overall in Jerusalem, this persecution that begins to take place after this group had reached their level of tolerance with this group of Hellenized Jews only heightens the spread of Christianity among the Hellenized Jews who go out into diaspora. Now, the Jews who were a part of this community, these Hellenists, were probably individuals who, at least at some point over the course of the past 400 years, had been anchored in some part of diaspora overall, outside of Jerusalem in some way, maybe from even parts outside of Judea as a whole. This removes that group from Jerusalem entirely. And once that happens, this group goes out, as it says there in Acts chapter 8, into all the regions of Judea and Samaria, and scattered as they were, they go about preaching the word. So this persecution leads to an initial burst of spread. And this group of converts, who was, of course, less attached to the temple and the trappings of Jerusalem anyway, were able to make the case to other Jews already outside of Jerusalem, already spread out throughout the region. This group is the most receptive early audience to the teachings about Jesus, and perhaps even more importantly, significantly and immediately grows the footprint of Christian teaching. This act, the stoning of Stephen that took place, which the leaders, of course, had to hope would stamp out this problem once and for all it does is significantly increase the footprint of Christian teaching. Now, of course, we must note the other person who is there that day, who's visible there in the background with coat sitting on his lap. The man who, from a purely historical viewpoint, is unquestionably the most significant figure in the spread of Christianity, in the eventual adoption of Christianity in Rome, and the eventual institutionalization that puts it in a position to dominate the world in such a short time frame, and that is, of course, Saul of Tarsus. Saul is a diaspora Jew from one of the wealthiest cities in the region, Tarsus. a Greek speaker. He's very well educated, a Pharisee. And after the stoning of Stephen, it is him who is tracking down the very Hellenized Jews who had left, who had been vanquished from Jerusalem, who are referenced there in Acts chapter 8, the ones who had left out from Jerusalem and began spreading. Saul leaves from Jerusalem himself to go track down these individuals that had spread out over Judea and Samaria. It's those very people that he's in the process of hunting down and killing. And of course, while doing so, while moving to track down these Hellenized Jews, moving out of Jerusalem and all across the region on the road to Damascus, Saul's life is changed forever. The stoning of Stephen provides a microcosm for the essential factors that ensured the early foundation of the rise of Christianity. The Hebrews, the group referenced in Acts chapter 6, remained in Jerusalem under the direction of James, the brother of Jesus, the home base of the early church in so many ways. The Hellenists moved into diaspora, spread out all over Judea, Samaria, and well beyond. And of course, Paul, teaching to the Gentiles. Those three made up sort of the three-legged stool that mold the early church, that mold the foundations of the early church, and who begin to take this movement from just another group of messianic followers disappointed by the outcome of their Messiah's death to global dominance. But let's step back just a little bit. Let's pursue this question in a more macro way. Let's look at some of the macro factors that really contribute to this. What is it from a historical standpoint that allows this movement to thrive and grow? I'll argue to you there are at least four major factors, four factors that converge in this seemingly perfect moment in history that regardless of whether one is a believer or not, one must acknowledge leads to the most important and significant religious movement of all time. That's just a fact. It is just a fact that this is the most widespread, most significant religious movement in history. What are some of the macro factors that achieve that? First, we already discussed this, but Jewish diaspora is an incredibly, tremendously important factor. At the time of Paul's conversion, there are likely more Jews who live outside of Judea than inside of Judea, probably by a rather significant amount. This is not only the Jews who were in Babylon 400 years earlier who didn't return. There are several Jews that were taken off to Rome by Pompey whenever Pompey invaded Jerusalem in the 60 years before Jesus' birth. And that community in Rome, the community of Jews in Rome, had grown by some estimates to as many as 100,000 people by the time of Paul's conversion, at the time here of the early church that we're talking about. That's just in the capital. In Egypt, estimates are as high as that there were 1 million Jews living in Egypt at that time, a great number of which are, of course, headquartered in Alexandria. Kelsey and I were just in Egypt in December, and the number of Jews in Egypt today is 10. Not 10 million, not 10,000, 10. But at this time, at the time of Paul's conversion to Christianity, there are, by some estimates, as many as 1 million Jews who live in Egypt. Look at the places that are referenced in Acts chapter 2 from the day of Pentecost that come from all over the places that are mentioned: Libya, Cyrene, Rome, all of these various places that Jews are coming to participate in Pentecost from all of these places all across the Mediterranean, all across the civilized world that Jews live. This is an extremely important factor in bridging the regional divide and bridging the gap and spreading the footprint of Christianity. Now, of course, many Jews rejected Paul's teachings. Many Jews rejected the early teachings of the apostles and all of the followers of Jesus. And they created very serious problems in so many instances, some of which are documented for us, some of which are documented by secular historians, but which we are well aware of, that many Jews created serious problems for the early Christians. But diaspora provided an entryway into various areas and the prospect of early converts. James's letter shows this. James chapter 1, verse 1. James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Okay, so James is writing this before 70 AD. The dispersion of Jews would grow much larger even after 70 AD, after, of course, the Jews are kicked out of Jerusalem and largely kicked out of Judea. That dispersion would grow much larger. James is writing before this. So we know the impact that this dispersion had on the growth of early Christianity. There are people in cities all across the Mediterranean who either from the day of Pentecost or from the apostles going out and teaching or through other forms convert and become a part of this early burgeoning movement. I do want to reference this as well. This is one of the other factors, of course, that makes this regional divide so important, that oftentimes, virtually always, whenever Paul would go to a new city, the place that he would go first would be the synagogues, or the place that he would go often would be the synagogues. There's 7 cities right there that we have, 8 cities that we have documentation of in Acts of him working in the synagogue. So this is an extremely, extremely important factor. And remember, this is not just the case for Paul, but for all 12 apostles going out teaching in these places. How many Jews became Christians? Historians have tried to measure this question repeatedly with very little success. It's not an insignificant number, but it is certainly outweighed rather quickly by the Gentile conversion that takes place. But the first century overall is not one of explosive growth for the entire church. We shouldn't think of it merely in a way of the number of Jews that converted. It really is more about the building of the foundation that takes place, that foundational growth that takes place, and the spreading of that footprint of the gospel. But make no mistake, few factors were in total more important than the diaspora that in building the foundation. This is a slide here that shows that post-70 AD dispersion that takes place in all of the various places all around the Mediterranean, into Europe, into Northern Africa, and into Asia, where Jews are moved to. And of course, so many of these pockets of Jews had with them pockets of Christians. Several times you would have individuals who would convert at various points. But again, the key factor for this is the foundational growth and the growth of the footprint that's provided by both of these things. It's interesting the way that the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, plays a role even in something like this. Just as relevant, I would argue, in so many ways, Hellenization is a gift for early Christianity. Few issues would define the early struggles intellectually, culturally, etc., the way Hellenization did. Now, we've already made reference to this with the Hellenists and the Hebrews in the first years of the church, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. This is a class in itself. Paul's visit to Athens is so much more than just another sermon. It's really the beginning of the intellectual marriage that created what we now call Western civilization. The void that was left by the stagnation of Greek philosophy that predated Jesus by a great deal, the void that is left by the stagnation of Greek philosophy in so many ways is filled by Christianity and the early Christian writers, along with the church, allowing the church to move into the rank of the educated, to move into the upper ranks of wealthier, educated, land-holding individuals. It was an essential factor all in its own. The Apostolic Fathers deal with this. Justin the Martyr deals with this a great deal. He is this. Between Pentecost and Nicaea, this is a huge factor. But there's something that's far more important, I would argue, far more basic and more important than Hellenism's centrality in the intellectual development of early Christianity. As we've discussed in this class, the birth of Jesus is preceded by 3 uninterrupted centuries of Greek cultural dominance. This was Alexander's vision to the extent that one could be attributed to him. One humanity, as I have called it. We discussed it in great detail in our 4th class. The Greeks placed a blanket of unification all across the region, one that unified the language, which is, of course, essential, one that unified the academic standards, one that unified the structure of cities. The world around Judea and the eastern Mediterranean, the central Mediterranean, the decades after Jesus' death are remarkably homogeneous. The Greeks are to thank for this, especially Alexander the Great, but the Greeks and everything that comes after are to thank for this. The 7 churches of Asia are in Asia Minor, not in the Far East, thanks to Hellenism. This map here on the screen is a map that shows the dark blue are the regions where Greek was the majority language spoken in this part of the eastern and central Mediterranean. And the light blue is where a large percentage of the population spoke Greek. You can see the piece at Alexandria there at the mouth of the Nile. Of course, most of Greece, most of southern Italy, all of that area of Asia there, and what is, of course, now Turkey. But this unification, this homogeneous unification that took place in this region is an essential factor. I want to note just quickly how essential language is in this spread. This obviously allows people to communicate with one another, and to understand each other. That is, of course, quite important. It's one of the reasons that our relationship with the Anglo world has always been much closer than our relationship with the Spanish-speaking world, for example. As the common expression always goes, the Atlantic is narrower than the Channel, as the English often say. Language makes a huge, drastic difference in the ability to exchange ideas and the ability to communicate ideas. That's obvious. The linguistic advantages are far deeper than that, though. It means the conceptual frameworks that each of these individuals and each of these communities would use would be similar. It means that there would be an equality of meaning among words and phrases and understanding. It means that things like metaphor are uniform throughout the entire region. We could talk about this for an hour, how essential this is. We won't. I think we get it. But the point is incredibly critical. The unified language of the Mediterranean, the unified language especially of the upper classes in virtually every city in Rome, virtually every city throughout the entire empire, is extremely essential for the rise and spread of early Christianity. I'll also note just a tidbit that I've always found quite interesting that notes the benefit of this spread of culture. Alexander the Great's furthest venture east was into India. It's there that his army pushed back on him. They had been fighting for 10 years. They wanted to return back home to see their family for some reason. And Alexander allegedly sits down whenever they reach India and cries because there's no worlds left to conquer. He eventually gives over to his troops who want to march back home. Of course, he never makes it back home. He dies on the way there. But the furthest reaches of his empire and of his kingdom and his conquest is in India. The apostle who reaches the furthest east was Thomas, who was himself martyred in India. Sometimes little facts like that makes it seem like there's somebody who knows what they're doing around with these things. Pretty incredible little tidbit of history. The third factor, the Romans didn't interfere with the cultural rootings of Hellenism. It's extremely important. As we've discussed multiple times, the Romans weren't interested in that. That was not how they governed empire. They wanted you to pay your taxes. They didn't really care what you thought about Plato's concept of the soul. They weren't interested in that. But what they did provide that was essential, an essential factor in the growth of the faith, was the most advanced road system in history up to that point. Roman roads are an essential macro factor of why it is that this movement does not die and that Christianity is able to begin spreading. Roads are not just an infrastructure advancement, they're a technological advancement. They're probably the grandest technological advancement of the age. When you consider how religious beliefs grew in the 2 millennia before Jesus' death, you begin to understand how idol worship and panoplies of gods, polytheism becomes the standard. Literacy rates are extremely low. There's no such thing as a vacation where you can go experience someone else's culture and way of life. Cultural interchange overall is extraordinarily limited, especially outside of a handful of cities. Athens, Rome, outside of a handful of cities, there's not a great deal of cultural interchange, especially when you consider beyond war. War is one of the only major factors, war and trade are one of the only major factors that lead to shared culture. So and those factors would have impacted a very small percentage of the population. So no advancement, though, does more to change that fact and to accelerate that sort of cultural interchange than the Roman road system does in this era. The roads are meant for access to resources, they're meant for rapid troop deployments and the movement of goods, and that it ends up becoming an incredibly beneficial fact for early Christians. It means that this system of roads is built for speed and efficiency. It means that missionaries can move between cities in a way that would have never been possible just 2 centuries earlier. If Jesus had been born 2 centuries prior to this, the world looks completely different. Moving between cities, spreading the gospel looks completely and totally different prior to this era and the unification of the Roman roads. The roads also mean access to resources. This is an incredibly important point as well. It's essential. Some people that we don't often consider. Roads mean inns. Think of the Good Samaritan story. They mean places to eat. They mean places to bathe. They mean places to rest your donkey or your horse. They're patrolled by a special detachment of Roman soldiers. All of this made it safer and easier to travel in and across the Mediterranean during the period. It's an essential factor in the macro factors that make sure that this movement doesn't end. The fourth and final macro factor that I will mention is Pax Romana. You may have heard this term in a history class at some point, but Pax Romana is the 200-year-long period of Roman peace, as it's called, that lasted from 27 BC after the dust settled on the most famous assassination in the history of the world, and the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. During this 200-year period, the Roman Empire was at its largest, as is referenced by the map there on the screen. There's a picture of the Roman Empire at its height that spreads all the way from what is now Britain in the north, all the way down into Egypt on the south, as far east as the Caspian Sea, as far west as the Atlantic Ocean. All across this space is the Roman Empire. Pax Romana is this 200-year period in which the empire is not only at its largest, but in many ways it is at its most peaceful and stable. This idea of Roman peace, like most things in survey history, are sort of oversimplified, but it's most accurately a period of Roman stability. That's very fair to categorize it as a period of Roman stability. This means that the world is relatively open to trade, relatively free of war, relatively free from the demands of military conflict, relatively free from plague, how lucky, relatively free from famine. One could say that Pax Romana is the perfect period to start an international movement. Jesus is born at nearly the beginning of the period. As I said, it starts dated at approximately 27 BC when Augustus becomes Caesar, when the empire really becomes an empire. Jesus is born less than 3 decades into this period, and the church grows for almost a full 150 years within this period between the death of Jesus and 180, the death of Jesus, which of course somewhere around 30 or 33 AD. 180 AD, when Marcus Aurelius dies, is when the period ends. So there's 150 years approximately inside of this period where the church is able to grow and flourish under these conditions of relative stability, relative peace, relatively free from major wars, especially if outside of Jerusalem, which is its own issue always, but relatively free from major war for the entire empire. It is the exact condition that one would need for a religious movement in its infancy to establish deep roots. So, those are the major factors. Those are the four. Are there others? Of course there are others. It's like I said, a survey of history. There are many people who point to the emptiness of paganism. There are many people who point to several other factors that contribute in these early days to why this movement is able to move and spread as quickly as it does. And we're talking, of course, just from a historic standpoint for why it does. We, of course, know and believe that there are deeper, more significant things at play than merely these macro factors. But whenever we take a historic examination and we look at the effect of the Jewish diaspora, the effect of Hellenization, the effect of Roman roads, and the effect of Pax Romana, these factors together are essential in leading to the growth and spread of early Christianity. The eventual adoption of Christianity as the religion of Rome has its own history, one that's deserving of our attention, but not this evening. It's obviously critical to the eventual explosion of the faith. Some historians have tried to guess exactly how many Christians there are at the end of the first century, and estimates are sometimes around 10,000. Sometimes you'll even see estimates as much as 5 to 10 times higher than that. But even if we take it at its largest possible estimate, at the end of the first century, the population of the Roman Empire when Constantine makes Christianity the state religion was 55 million people. It's an unparalleled explosion that takes place. And there's so many other factors, of course, that take place in between Paul's conversion, for example, or the day of Pentecost, for example, and the Council of Nicaea. There are tons of critical factors. But my focus this evening is not on understanding the full growth of the faith, and I know that from this point forward on Tuesdays, Larry Coffey's going to begin the class on the history of the church. My focus is not on understanding the full growth of the faith. It's in understanding our central question, which is, why didn't the movement die? Why wasn't the death of Jesus just another person claiming to be the Messiah, executed by the Romans and forgotten about, like the others who we've discussed in this class before? We discussed 7 or 8 different individuals who have propped up in Judea previously claiming to be the Messiah. Why isn't the death of Jesus just another one of those? Well, from the standpoint of historic examination, the timing is perfect. Look at all of these macro factors that converge together on top of one another that make the timing seemingly perfect for such a movement to grow. One cannot discount the importance of that particular fact. It is the timing of this is an incredibly important and in some ways faith-inducing point. The messengers who are put in place in the early church are extremely effective, remarkably effective, unfathomably effective at spreading the gospel. But isn't the timing just as relevant for the other messianic movements that we have made reference to over this class? In Acts chapter 21, Paul is mistaken for one of these false messiahs. Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Is the timing that we just made reference to not equally as perfect for this man, the Egyptian, this false Messiah who Paul is mistaken for in that moment? Is the timing not just as perfect for him? Does he not have the same access to the Roman roads and Pax Romana and unified Hellenism and the benefit of language as anyone else? This is precisely in line with Gamaliel's argument, who makes reference to 2 other men whose timing could have been equally just as vital. For before these days, Theodos rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all of who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. Their timing was just as convenient, they came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Same situation, Judas the Galilean. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan of this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. So they took his advice. Gamaliel's making the exact same argument, the exact same question essentially posed to the fellow members of the Sanhedrin in this moment in Acts chapter 5. But he illustrates this exact point. Are these two others not also benefited by Pax Romana and the unified Hellenistic language? If they are just another false Messiah, if they're just another group, they would pass away. But if not, and it's of a God, they would not be able to overthrow it. What an incredibly wise moment. There's something, of course, that critical history cannot account for. A fact of history that in 200 years of trying to explain, trying to find some sort of documentable proof that has never been properly accounted for by the critical historians who study the era and who ask this question: what is it that leads to this movement flourishing? Why is it that as other messianic movements passed away, that this one thrives? That this one not only thrives for a few years, for a few decades, for a century, but that we, 2,000 years later, are still committed to it. The 11 men who hide out in the upper room in the days following the crucifixion of their leader emerged from that upper room changed men. The men who had scattered in the garden, abandoning Jesus there at the site of the arresting party, were 7 weeks later unwavering before the crowds at Pentecost, even when Pilate was still the prefect, Caiaphas was still the high priest, all of the same leaders are still in place. 7 weeks after having abandoned Jesus in the garden at the site of the arresting party, these men are unwavering in the crowds at Pentecost. Each one of them are willing to, and all but one did, die a martyr's death, refusing to abandon an eyewitness claim that Jesus the Nazarene, who had been put through a Sanhedrin trial where he was convicted, who had been sentenced to die by way of crucifixion by the Romans, came forth from the grave and appeared to them resurrected. Each one of them refused, willing to die, with the eyewitness testimony that this is what had happened. Of all of the answers as to why this movement did not die, this is the one that above all the critical historian must wrestle with and has never created an appropriate explanation for. Above all, this is the factor that leads to this flourishing and this growth. Critical historians have never been able to establish an answer, but we have. We know why we believe those men emerged from the upper room changed. We know why we believe that those men on the day of Pentecost stood before the crowd unwavering in their commitment. We know that even after the council, the Sanhedrin, who had just weeks earlier condemned Jesus to death for blasphemy, told them to stop, that they said, "We cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard." We know why. This factor cannot be measured by history. You will not find it etched into stone anywhere. There's really no way to account for it, but it's the essential factor that answers our question. All of the macro factors, they're extremely important. They're extremely important. But nothing matches the fervor and zeal of the men who emerged from that upper room and what they achieved because of their eyewitness testimony. Before we close the book on this class, I want to make at least one more point that I would be remiss not to highlight. I've closed every class up to this point with these sort of cliffhangers, and I want to close this one with a point of relevancy. I hope that it's particularly useful in this particular moment. Machiavelli, the Italian Renaissance philosopher who most famously wrote the book The Prince and most properly understood as the first modern thinker, was one of the harshest critics of Christianity in history. Machiavelli looked upon Christianity with a certain disdain and had looked upon Roman strength with a certain admiration. He is, of course, an Italian. The church, he believed, was the source of weakness in Italy. It had ruined the culture of Italy, teaching men to despise worldly glory, teaching men to move away from the great achievements and advancement that the Romans had achieved before. What is it, Machiavelli wondered, that makes the church so powerful? Why was it that Christianity had been able to take over the Roman Empire? Why was it that it had become the dominant cultural force in all of Europe? Why had it become the dominant cultural force in the world? His answer is just as relevant to our question tonight of why the movement didn't die, and just as relevant in 2020 as it was when he was pondering the question in 1500. The source of Christianity's power, Machiavelli reasoned, was in its ability to take its message directly to the people without having to conquer a country militarily. Christianity had an inverse strength from virtually every other force made by man. Sometimes our critics provide us with the most valuable insights. Machiavelli was 100% right. The strength of Christianity in the first century, the reason that this movement didn't die, the strength in the first century, in the 4th century, in the 15th century, in the 21st century, is not in its ability to affect political systems. The strength of Christianity has always been, from the beginning, its ability to impact the hearts of men. Jesus made it clear at every opportunity given to him during his trial that he was not a revolutionary leader. He was not a bandit. He was not a zealot. He was not an insurrectionist. At every chance he could, he made clear that the messianic ambitions of overthrowing earthly government and establishing an earthly throne were misguided. They were a misunderstanding. They were not a reflection of the Messiah's true purpose. It's an ethos that allowed his message to spread and to dominate the world. And it's an ethos that each one of us, tasked individually with acting on the Great Commission, should be careful to protect. Thank you. The end.